Hello everybody. We're talking about North Korea today. As you know, North Korea is unique in that it is one of the last remaining Cold War era socialist nations, and it's notable for having a far bigger impact on the world stage than you would expect from such a small country. There are many myths and legends around North Korea and its government, and I will try to address as many of those as I can. We're going to go over the history, politics and economics of North Korea, and we'll hopefully learn something new. That being said, let's start. Korea has lots of history, as you may know. I will skip over most of it. So, by 1910, Japan had conquered and occupied all of Korea. They developed some industry, mostly in the north for geographical reasons. This grew the industrial working class. North Korea has many mountains, and anti-imperialist guerrilla fighters were using them to harass the Japanese army and government. Eventually, the Japanese client states in Korea and Manchuria were invaded/liberated by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. While the Soviets were advancing, many people's committees formed all across Korea and wanted to govern. When the Soviets reached Pyongyang, they found a socialist government made up of representatives from these councils. Naturally, they allied with them. Because this is the Cold War, the Americans couldn't accept that all of Korea may be ruled by these committees, so they talked to the Soviet Union, and after some negotiation, they decided to split the country on this line, which is the 38th parallel on a map. The north would be socialist and the south would be anti-socialist, aka fascist. It wouldn't become a democracy until decades later. The Soviets promoted and supported a prominent guerrilla fighter called Kim Il-sung, and he quickly took over the government. He then structured the country and its economy after the Soviet model. We'll see that in the politics and economics sections. At first, Kim Il-sung assumed that there would be a revolution in the South, considering the South had just as many people's councils and genuine socialists as the North. But when peaceful protesters were repeatedly, brutally oppressed by the Southern government, he realized that there would be no revolution in the South. So he decided to take it upon himself to liberate the people of the South. He got permission from Stalin and promises of support from China. On top of that, America withdrew all its troops from the South, leaving them with only inexperienced South Korean soldiers. The Northern Army, on the other hand, had a corps of veterans who had fought the Japanese. On top of that, they got new military equipment from their Soviet allies, while America didn't even trust the South with any tanks. 5 years after being liberated by the Soviets, the Northern Army launched an invasion/liberation of the South. Because of all these factors, the North won quickly, advancing through almost the entire country in 3 months. The international community did not like this. The UN, under the leadership of the USA, led a multinational intervention force, which of course was superior to the by comparison small North Korean army. I will skip over the war crimes and just say that the North was pushed all the way back to the Chinese border, at which point the Chinese People's Liberation Army joined the war and pushed the border all the way back to the 38th parallel. When they reached that point, they negotiated a ceasefire. The border was almost exactly the same as before. There would be a 4-kilometer wide demilitarized zone between the two countries. This still exists until today, and there has been no peace, only a never-ending ceasefire. After the war, and with Chinese and Soviet support, North Korea experienced a post-war economic boom, which lasted until the 80s, at which point the economy stagnated. More on that in the economics section. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. This was a major problem for Korea. They imported almost all of their food from the USSR, so the fact that the USSR ceased to exist caused major food shortages. It also caused a lot of economic hardship as China was left as the only ally and trade partner of the country. This only strengthened North Korea's belief in self-reliance. It's a core feature of the Juche idea. I have a video on that. Essentially, they want to be economically and militarily independent of all other nations. This is why they have an army of 6 million, because they want to be able to hold off a full-scale American invasion on their own. And that's why they are spending so much effort on making nukes and ICBMs. It's about defending themselves from other countries, mostly the USA. The logic goes that nobody wants to be nuked, so nobody will invade them. Basically, the concept of the Cold War on a small scale. Nowadays, Korea has mixed relations with China, among other things because of the continued nuclear tests, which have been condemned by the entire international community. China still supports North Korea, if only to avoid a unified Korea which is friendly to the Americans. South Korea and the USA, on the other hand, aren't exactly friends of North Korea. Their relations are somewhat improving. For example, in 2019, the US President and the Supreme Leader of Korea met. The South Korean President also met with him the same year. Nothing else has come of this, but it's a nice gesture, I guess. Talking about Supreme Leader, who's that? The answer lies in the politics section. The Supreme Leader is, of course, you know him and you love/hate him, the one and only Kim Jong-un. He is the son of Kim Jong-il and the grandson of the guerrilla resistance fighter from earlier, Kim Il-sung. Now, these are all related to each other, which leads to people who don't know how the North Korean state is constructed to compare it to monarchy. This is so extreme that when they thought Kim Jong-un died a few months ago, they looked at the family history to try to determine the successor, which is not how it works. Believe it or not, North Korea is not a monarchy, and the supreme leader is in fact selected or elected, depending on definitions, and just because a total of 2 times they selected people from the same family doesn't make it monarchist. After Castro died, his brother took over. Are we therefore to conclude that Cuba is a monarchy? Of course not. Political dynasties are pretty common, especially without term limits. Of course there's this weird cult of personality around these 3 guys, but they were all elected to their positions. North Korea is not a monarchy, it's a one-party state with nepotism. But how is the Supreme Leader selected? Time to look at what the title of Supreme Leader even means. It sounds like a shorthand title for dictator in a bad movie, but in the North Korean constitution, it is an official title given to the President of the State Affairs Commission, currently Kim Jong-un, previously the other 2. Now you're bound to wonder what the State Affairs Commission does. Essentially, it's a commission which checks every part of the government. It supervises the cabinet, which I'll come to later, and it supervises the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of State Security, and Ministry of Social Security. This commission used to be called the National Defense Commission, which gives you a look at what it's like. Kim Jong-un is also Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of North Korea, which means he's Commander-in-Chief, but that's a separate position. Essentially, the task of the 14 members of the State Affairs Commission is to supervise every part of the government to make sure they are ready to work together for defense of the country. Americans may have long forgotten about the war in Korea, but they haven't. The state is still practically in a state of war, ready to oppose a military invasion at any time. But if this commission is so powerful, how are the members selected? By the Supreme People's Assembly, essentially the North Korean parliament. The parliament votes on a president of the State Affairs Commission, who then appoints the 13 other positions, and the parliament has to confirm these appointments. The parliament also votes on new laws and changes to the constitution. It is unicameral again, meaning there's only one elected body. The members are selected by the 687 constituencies for 5-year terms. These are local elections. The way they work is that anyone above the age of 17 can be a candidate, and then before the election the Communist Party meets and decides on one candidate per district, who is then the one candidate people can vote on. Of course, technically anyone can be in the Communist Party, so indirectly anyone can influence on who the candidate will be, but practically the Communist Party is in charge of who becomes a member of parliament. Because of this, the parliament is majority Korean Workers' Party, and it has been since the war. As is typical in this series, the Supreme People's Assembly only meets a few times a year to do the tasks like changing the constitution. And what do they do when not in session? Say it all together now. They elect a committee to take over the tasks of the Parliament when it is not in session. This standing committee of the Supreme People's Assembly has 15 members. They are not officially employed anywhere else, and in theory they're independent of things like the party and the Supreme Leader, while they make decisions about legislation. Next is the Cabinet of North Korea, which is essentially a council of ministers. All the ministers are in the cabinet. They're appointed by the Supreme People's Assembly, aka the Parliament. They essentially run the executive part of government. The Parliament says what they want to happen, and the executive goes about doing that thing. Having talked about the executive and the legislative, only one branch remains, the judiciary. The members of the High Court are selected by Parliament. There are also provincial and special city-level courts, which are selected by the equivalent local government. Nothing too exciting. As the People's Republic of Korea is a one-party state, that party is kind of significant. It's called the Workers' Party of Korea. The party has local organizations on all levels. On the national level, the main body is the Party Congress, made up of the party representatives from all around the country. The Congress votes on the chairman of the party, currently Kim Jong-un. They also elect the Central Committee of the Communist Party, which, as you guessed, is a body that takes over the tasks of the Congress while it is not in session. They also selected a Central Auditioning Commission who observe what everyone is doing in the government while the Congress is out of session. The influence of the Communist Party is not to be ignored. They impact many layers of the government. For example, the way I told it, there is no way for Kim Jong-un to influence the lawmakers. After all, he's in the executive branch, running the military commission, not in parliament. And the High Court may seem independent the way I told it. The Communist Party is key to how it actually works. Sure, legally speaking, the Supreme Leader has no way to enact a law, but a Communist Party chairman could tell his party comrades to enact a law. And since the Communist Party rules the parliament, the chairman can effectively enact any law he wants to. Who was chairman again? Oh yeah, the Supreme Leader himself, Kim Jong-un. For similar reasons, the High Court only ever has members of the Communist Party in it. And sure, anyone can stand for election, but if you aren't in the party, they will select someone else for your constituency. And remember, it's one candidate per constituency. And naturally, all high positions which are theoretically elected by the parliament, like ministers and judges, are effectively decided on by the Central Committee of the party. The party believes in Juche, which is a long story, and I already made a video on that, so go watch that after this one. Let us finally come to the economics. Economic goals are decided by the Central Committee of the party, and the State Planning Committee is tasked with implementing them. It's a Soviet-style planned economy. After the Korean War, the North was completely destroyed because of the intense American bombardment that took place. This was, of course, very bad for the people, but it was actually good for the economy. You see, when a country is destroyed and people lose everything, then they will seek a job and buy all the products they lost during the war. And if everyone buys one of everything, that means strong economic growth. This is why you see an economic boom happening after every major destructive war. And the same thing hit North Korea. In addition to that, North Korea got lots of international aid from the USSR and China, because socialist nations support each other. There was tremendous economic growth and improvement in living standards between the war and the 80s. In this period, North Korea was actually doing better than the South in almost every way. Of course, the economic miracles stopped when the people had replaced all products. This caused economic stagnations in the 80s. But as I said before, stagnation doesn't mean things are getting worse, it just means things don't change much. But then 1991 happened and the socialist world collapsed. This was a hard hit for the North Korean economy. It was largely focused on heavy industry and not on farming. They got most food by trading with the Soviet Union. After Gorbachev introduced Pizza Hut, the new Russian Federation didn't want to trade with the communist nation anymore. Not to mention the Russian economy was in free fall as well. On top of that, droughts and floods caused food production to decrease, and that meant famine. The death toll varies wildly depending on who you ask, and there are no numbers from the Korean government itself. It's somewhere in the range of 200 to 500,000. The starvation was eventually ended by international aid coming from unexpected places like South Korea and the USA. Nowadays, the Korean economy is very much focused on self-reliance, both because that is a core part of the duty idea and because of economic reality. There is barely anyone to trade with Korea, because most nations are capitalist and they consider North Korea an evil dictatorship that eats babies. The only trade partner for Korea is China. And even that trade is very little nowadays. North Korea is under an international embargo because of the nuclear tests, so no country or company can legally trade with anyone in North Korea. This is also why it seems like the North hasn't been developing since the 90s. It's because the 90s were the last time they had access to outside technology. You often see Western media focus on this. For example, a proof that North Korea is bad is that they have subway cards which are from the 80s and things which break, like a ceiling light, are not replaced. Completely neglecting the fact that North Korea cannot import spare parts, and North Korea flat out doesn't have the industry to produce every little thing. You need a global economy to reach the standards of living we have in the West. Our electronics are assembled in Taiwan, our cars come from Germany, gold comes from the Congo, and lithium batteries come from Bolivia. North Korea has none of those because of the embargo. People like to point at North Korea and say that socialism doesn't work, but this is very much not even close to reality. People point at North Korea and say civilians aren't even allowed to drive cars, which, yeah, sounds bad, but that's for two reasons. One is that North Korea has no way to produce cars, and more significantly, North Korea has no oil field and it's impossible for them to import oil. So North Koreans driving cars would be impossible because they wouldn't have anything to run their cars with. People instead go by subway, bike or train. North Korea is heavily using trains run on coal. And that seems like an ancient technology to us, because our trains are run on diesel or more commonly electricity. But one of the few natural resources North Korea has is coal. So they use it for everything, for heating, for power generation and to run trains. Really, the North Korean economy is what happens when a country is forcibly isolated from the global economy and somehow has to exist on its own. And of course, the North Korean economy can't produce everything the global economy produces, so they're falling behind in, well, everything. So in conclusion, I can say that North Korea is a very unique country. It's a democracy on paper and not really in praxis. It is in constant tension with both South Korea and the USA, and its economy is a USSR-style planned economy without any access to the global market, causing the country to fall behind the rest of the world. And my hot take is still that it's not a monarchy, no matter what American TV tells me. Also, here's a fun fact. The full title of Kim Jong-un is Supreme Leader and President of the State Affairs Commission, General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of North Korea, Chairman of the Central Military Commission of the Workers' Party of Korea, member of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea, Marshal of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Kim Jong-un. Thanks to my patrons for enabling me to have an income without putting annoying ads on my videos. And I especially thank Cormat Asshole, Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Hugo Castelos, Attila Nemetz, Bryn Floss, Carissa, who's new, Chairman Pineapple, Daniel Hyman, Dr. Grimm, Emily Marigold Klassen, Gavi Gita, Herdington Gerdington, Joshua Clark, Klastrup Mazije Rojek, Nana Epema, Neil Banderi, Nicholas Wiggins, Nora Quinn, Ollie, Pote, Raymond DeVille, Sean Murphy, Stairmaster Chef, Stefan or Stephen and Trey.